The city had begun to drown in another gray winter evening, with fog curling like secrets around the glass buildings and people scurrying along the pavements, unaware that the man on the top floor of the tallest tower of Kana, the youngest, self-made billionaire in the country, sat in his sterile office, surrounded by silence that screamed louder than any storm. He had everything the world could offer: money, luxury, power, and fear, but not a soul he could call his own. And he wore that emptiness like a designer suit, polished on the outside, but torn on the inside, where no one dared to look. And as he leaned back in his leather chair, going through files worth millions, the last thing he expected was a soft knock on his glass door, followed by the sight of a soaking wet little girl who looked like she'd stepped out of a painting, too sad for words. Her tiny figure wrapped in a school sweater 2 sizes too big, her hair tied in a lopsided braid, and her shoes squeaking on the marble floor as she stepped forward with trembling determination. The receptionist ran behind her, gasping apologies. But before she could reach, the girl stopped in front of Arav's desk, looked him in the eye with a courage that shook him, and said, "Sir, if you marry my mommy, maybe she smile." Again, and in that one sentence, the walls he had built around himself for years cracked just slightly, enough to let something through that he hadn't felt in decades. Feeling stunned, Arav stared at her, speechless, while the little girl dug into her school bag and pulled out a wrinkled drawing. It had 3 stick figures, one tall and sad, labeled Mommy, one small and smiling, labeled me, and one with a question mark, standing beside them, holding their hands. The girl looked at him with wide eyes and said, "My name is Near. My mommy is Mir. She works here, in your cleaning department. She always works late and never laughs. But I saw you once in the lobby, and I thought, maybe you could fix her like daddies fix things in stories." And something about her innocence, her audacity, her painful hope made Arav forget his rigid schedule, forget his cold image, forget that he hadn't spoken to a child in over 15 years, and he quietly told the receptionist to bring Mihar to his office. 15 minutes later, the elevator doors opened and Mihar rushed in, her face pale with horror, her janitor's uniform damp and clinging to her, her hands trembling as she grabbed Noor and pulled her close, apologizing in a flurry of panic and shame, saying, "I'm so sorry, sir. She doesn't understand. She must be seeing something. I'll talk to her." But Arav raised a hand and said, in a voice even he didn't recognize, "It's okay. She didn't do anything wrong." And Mihar froze, stunned. Because this wasn't the voice of the man she saw from a distance every night. This was someone else, someone softer, someone real. He knelt down beside Noor, gave her the drawing back, and asked, "Why me?" And Noor, as if she had prepared her whole life for that question, replied, "Because you looked lonely. And people who look lonely understand other lonely people better." And with that one sentence, the man who had conquered skyscrapers felt smaller than a child who just wanted to see her mother smile. Offered her tea, and the entire floor went silent because the staff had never seen their terrifying boss offer anyone a chair, let alone a conversation. And as Meher sat talkward, humiliated, apologizing, under her breath, Rav, Ruth listened. He asked simple questions, and Meher, unsure of what to say, told him she'd been working night shifts for years, raising Noor alone since her husband left when Noor was just a baby, never taking a day off because daycare was expensive and life didn't allow her time to fall apart. And Arv, sitting across from her in his $1,000 suit, realized this woman, this janitor, this invisible hero had more courage than anyone in his boardroom. As the conversation ended, he stood up and surprised even himself by saying, "Can I take you both out for dinner tomorrow?" And Mihar stared at him like he'd spoken another language, then looked down, murmuring, "Sir, this isn't necessary." But Noor jumped up and clapped, saying, "I knew you'd say yes." And that one burst of joy shattered every bit of cynicism left in Arav's chest. That night, he went home not to silence, but to thoughts that kept him awake. Thoughts of a little girl with wild hope in her eyes, and a woman whose strength came not from success, but from survival. And somewhere between midnight and morning, Arav decided something that would change his life forever. For once, he wouldn't ignore the ache in his heart or the pull in his soul. He would listen, and for the first time in years, he smiled to himself, unaware that this was just the beginning of a story no money could buy. The next evening arrived like a whisper, soft and uncertain, and Meher still couldn't understand how someone like her, janitor working night shifts to survive, was now standing in front of her mirror, fixing her daughter's hair while wearing the only decent kurti she owned, waiting for a man like Arav Khanna, whose name alone was enough to freeze people in their tracks. She had almost canceled 5 times that day, telling herself it was foolish, inappropriate, dangerous. Even he was a billionaire, a man who moved through a world of crystal glasses and silent chauffeurs, and she was just Meher, a single mother, who skipped meals to afford Noor's books, but every time she thought of canceling, she saw Noor's hopeful little face lighting up with the words, "Mommy, he likes Usai, just know it." And she didn't have the heart to take that hope away. So when the doorbell rang and Arav stood there in jeans and a casual navy blue shirt, holding a bouquet of white lilies and a tiny purple backpack for Noor. Something inside Mahor fluttered. Part of her that hadn't moved in years. Noor ran into his arms like she'd done it forever, and Arav scooped her up effortlessly, saying, "I hope you like pasta and magic tricks," and she squealed, "Only if you make mommy smile." The evening passed, not in awkward silences, but in warm conversations, messy pizza slices, and a magician who made Noor laugh so hard she spilled soda all over Arav's shirt. But he didn't flinch. He just laughed with her, and Mihar stared in disbelief at the man who once terrified everyone, now giggling over a coloring book with her daughter in his lap. As days turned into weeks, something impossible began unfolding. Arav started showing up at newer school recitals, cheering the loudest even when she forgot her lines, arriving early to carry her school bag, sending home-cooked food on Meher's shifts, and slowly but surely becoming a part of their world without asking for permission, without needing labels. He didn't take Mehar to luxury hotels or hide her from the public eye. He walked beside her in public parks, held her umbrella when it rained, sat beside her on rickety benches as Noor chased pigeons. And when people stared or whispered, he met their gaze with pride, never shame. Mihar, at first, resisted telling him over and over that this wasn't his world, that she wasn't someone who belonged beside a man like him. But every time she tried to pull away, he'd say something that unraveled her walls, like the day he looked her straight in the eye and said, "Do you know the first time I felt peace in 20 years? When you made me tea in a steel cup and sat on the floor next to me without asking for anything." And her breath caught in her throat, because in that moment she realized he didn't love her in spite of her reality. He loved her because of it. Noor, of course, believed they were already a family, drawing pictures of Daddy Arv walking her to school, telling her classmates proudly, "My new daddy's not perfect, but he's trying so hard." And every time she said that, Arv would blink hard and hold her a little tighter, because those words meant more to him than any award, any empire he'd built. But not everyone was happy. Rumors spread in ROF's elite circles. Business rivals mocked him. Tabloids called Meher the Cinderella maid. And one day, a board member cornered him after a meeting and said, "Do you really think a janitor and her child are your legacy?" To which Arav, calm but firm, replied, "They are the only part of my life that's real and that silenced even his most arrogant critics." But Mihar couldn't ignore the storm. It reached her building. Her coworkers whispered, her manager scolded her, and one cruel evening, Noor came home crying because another kid at school said, "Your mommy is just stealing his money." And that shattered something inside Mihar that even Araf's kindness couldn't fix. That night, she called him and said, "You're too kind to see it. But I can't let Noor live in your shadow wheel. Always be charity to people like them." And she ended the call before he could say a word. Packing their few things, leaving behind only a note. "You gave us more than we ever dreamed. That's why I have to let you go before the dream turns into shame." Araf was shattered, not just heartbroken, but lost, like a man who had just discovered sunlight only to be thrown back into the dark. He searched everywhere, called, visited, waited, but Meher had vanished, and for days, weeks. He stared at Noor's old drawings like a lifeline, whispering to himself, "She didn't just give me love. She gave me purpose." And so, he did what he'd never done before. He made it public. In the biggest interview of his life, broadcast to millions, Araf faced the camera, held up Noor's crumpled drawing, and said, "This isn't a joke. This isn't a fling. I'm not ashamed of them. Mihar and Noor are my home, and if anyone believes love has a class, I suggest they look at their own heart." And the world fell silent, watching the coldest CEO bare his soul on national television, not for ratings, but for the woman and child who taught him to feel. Mihar, who saw the broadcast from a small apartment where she'd taken shelter, wept into her scarf, and Noor turned to her and whispered, "Mommy." He didn't give up, and Mihar, through sobs, replied, "He never has." And before sunrise the next morning, they were standing outside Araf's mansion, New York, holding Maher's hand and a folded paper, and when the door opened and Araf saw them, he didn't say a word, just dropped to his knees and hugged them both so tightly it felt like time had stopped. Noor slid the paper into his hand, and on it were 3 stick figures, again this time, holding hands, and above them, Noor had written, "We are a family now. No more question marks." I'll never imagine that a home wasn't built with marble chandeliers or imported furniture, but with messy breakfasts, bedtime giggles, soft kisses on tired foreheads, and 2 warm arms around him at the end of a long day. And that truth settled into every corner of his life after Mihar and Noor moved into the mansion that once felt more like a museum than a place to live. It began with small changes, a pair of tiny pink slippers beside his leather shoes, a row of bright plastic cups beside his crystal glasses, children's drawings pinned to the fridge beside stock reports, and Mihar's soft voice humming old lullabies in the hallway where silence used to echo like loneliness. The once lonely billionaire, who thrived on schedules and silence, now found his days filled with the chaos of love. Noor bouncing on his back every morning, yelling, "Wake up, sleepyhead. Mihar scolding both of them for leaving cereal bowls on the couch, and Arav learning how to braid Noor's hair because daddy knots were apparently a thing now. Even if they turned out lumpy and crooked, he'd never known this kind of joy that wasn't bought or borrowed, but born from the way Meher smiled when he came home early, from how Noor wrapped her arms around him when he was too tired to speak, and how, during those quiet nights, when they all curled up in one blanket, he no longer felt like a man carrying the weight of empires, but just a man finally held. But despite the happiness that bloomed in every room, Arav carried one quiet yearning desire to make it permanent, to tell the world that this wasn't temporary or accidental, but the most important chapter of his life. And so, after months of waiting, planning, and holding his breath, he decided to ask Meher to marry him, not with a press release, not with photographers or diamond ads, but with sincerity, stillness, and something that belonged only to them. On the anniversary of the day Noor walked into his office, he took them both to a beachside cliff where the wind was wild and free, just like Noor's laughter, and as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky gold and violet, he turned to Meher, took her calloused hands in his polished ones, knelt on one knee, not as a billionaire, but as a man in love, and opened a velvet box that didn't contain a diamond, but a simple silver band inscribed with the words, "You made me whole," and he said, "Meher, I want to grow old braiding Noor's hair and making burnt toast with you. I want this chaos, this love, this life forever. Will you marry me? Not because I'm wealthy, but because I can't breathe without you two anymore." And Meher, who had once scrubbed office floors, afraid to look anyone in the eye, now broke into tears, not of fear, but of joys. She whispered, "Yes, Arav, I've been yours since the moment you made my daughter believe in magic again." Noor screamed and clapped, yelling yeses. "I knew this would happen. I'm the best Cupid ever," and demanded that they dance right there on the sand, barefoot and laughing, while waves kissed their ankles and stars lit up above like the universe had thrown them a private celebration. The wedding came weeks later, not at a palace or five-star hotel, but in their backyard garden, transformed by fairy lights, wildflowers, marigold garlands, and Noor's handmade crafts, where the guest list included their neighbors, Arav's loyal staff, children from Meher's old neighborhood, and even the kind tea seller who once let Meher owe him for 2 weeks straight when she was jobless and hungry. Meher wore a simple peach sari with jasmine in her hair, looking more radiant than any model ever could, while Arav wore a cream kurta embroidered by hand, by Mihar's favorite boutique auntie, who insisted true love deserves pure thread. And Noor walked ahead of them, tossing petals like a glittering fairy commander, proudly shouting, "Make way." When they exchanged vows, there were no rehearsed lines, just words born from years of wounds and healing. "I promise to hold your fears like my own," Mihar said, "to protect your dreams, to never let Noor go to sleep doubting she's loved." And Araf, wiping tears, replied, "I promise to love you through silence and storms, to never forget how you saved me without even trying." And as they sealed it with a kiss, the crowd cheered, Mihar's hands shook, and Noor shouted, "Ooh, but okay, I'll allow it." That night, under the stars, they didn't cut a designer cake, but shared homemade laddus, danced to old Bollywood songs, and lit sky lanterns with wishes. Arafs said, "Thank you for coming back." Mihar said, "For love, not luck." And Nurse said, "Can we get a puppy next?" Married life was never perfect, but it was real, warm, honest, and filled with new adventures. Arav started mentoring young entrepreneurs who came from poor backgrounds, like Mihar once did, using her story as an example of resilience. Mer opened a community center for working mothers, offering free childcare, skill training, and hot meals. And Noor became a miniature star. She started a vlog called Noor's New Daddy Diaries, where she shared her stories of bedtime, jokes, pasta, disasters, and how sometimes love comes in scary offices, but turns out squishy in the end. Arav's empire didn't fall, it thrived more than ever, because he no longer lived only to expand business, but to build legacy, one filled with humanity, equality, and second chances. Investors respected him more, not less, and when asked at a press conference what changed him most in the last year, he simply replied, "A girl with crayons and hope walked into my life and reminded me I had a heart." Every holiday became a celebration of their journey, Diwalis, lit with laughter and matching pajamas. Birthdays that started with burnt pancakes and ended with homemade photo albums. And even regular Sundays became sacred reading stories on the couch, singing off-tune karaoke, and stargazing from the rooftop, where Noor always claimed she could hear the moon smiling at them. One rainy evening, while sitting by the fireplace, Noor curled up in Araf's lap and asked, "Will you still love Mommy when she's old and wrinkly?" And Araf kissed her forehead and whispered, "I love her even when we're both forgetful and toothless, and she still yells at me for not folding the laundry," making Mihar laugh until tears came. 'Cause that was the kind of life she'd never imagined for herself. Life where love wasn't dramatic or perfect, but present, consistent, and patient. One day, years later, when Noor was old enough to understand more, She asked Arav, "Did you ever think you'd become a father?" And he looked at her, his eyes soft, and said, "No, but you made me one the day you handed me that drawing, and said your mommy needed to smile again." That moment, Noor, was when my whole life began, and she hugged him tighter than ever before, whispering, "And you didn't just make her smile. You made her believe again." And as seasons changed, their story became something people shared not as a fairy tale, but as proof that kindness still had power, that even the coldest hearts could be rewritten by love, and that sometimes all it takes to change the world is a little girl brave enough to ask for something simple, a family. And though Arav, Meher, and Noor faced storms, hard days, misunderstandings, and moments of fear, like all families do, they always came back to that truth: love is not made of perfection. It's made of persistence, of choosing each other again and again, no matter how messy life gets. And on every anniversary, they'd sit together, holding hands, looking at that old, wrinkled drawing now framed in their hallway, where the stick figures had no more question marks, only 3 hearts drawn above their heads. And Noor, now older, would grin and say, "Best story ever." And I wrote the first line